It was supposed to be just another Thursday. I had a short list: carrots, eggs, and the cinnamon soap Ruth always liked. The market was half full, early light still stretching across the booths, steam rising from coffee cups and baked bread. I was about to pay for a jar of jam when a boy in a gray vest stopped in front of me. "Are you Luan Mera's mother?" He said it so casually I nearly dropped my bag. He said you'd understand. Told me to find you here. Open this somewhere quiet. He handed me a sealed package, plastic-wrapped, nothing on the outside, but my name written in Luan's handwriting. I didn't speak. I didn't ask who he was. I just nodded. Once. At home, my hands shook as I cut the edge open. Inside was a folded photo, creased like it had been hidden for weeks. My son, older, thinner eyes, dark and hollow. Sitting against a concrete wall. No coat, just a sweatshirt I didn't recognize. The note was only one line: "I'm alive. I'm safe. Please don't tell Valine." Asked for the red barn near Kenner Hill. My knees gave way before my voice could. For 3 years I'd been told he was in Australia, that he'd taken some overseas contract and needed space, that the time zone made calls hard, that emails didn't go through, that he didn't want to talk, not yet. And I believed it. Because I trusted her. I folded the photo, slipped it into my coat pocket like it might disappear. I stared out the window, the backyard still blank with morning. 3 years. And my son had been close enough to send a message. I got up, took my keys, and walked out the door without locking it. Kenner Hill wasn't far. 3 years ago, Valine stood in my kitchen with her purse already on her shoulder and told me Luan had taken a tech job in Australia. She spoke quickly, like someone delivering news she didn't want questioned. He didn't want a fuss, she said. It's best to let him go quietly. I remember nodding. I remember the way she kept her eyes on the sink instead of me. After that, the rules changed without being announced. When I asked to call him, she said the rates were too expensive. When I suggested video chat, she said the connection overseas was unreliable. Every message I sent went through her. Every reply came back. Filtered, shortened, polished into something that sounded less like my son and more like a summary of him. Busy. Settling in. Exhausted. Next month, Mom. At first, I told myself this was what independence looked like. Children grew up. They went far. Mothers learned to wait. When birthdays passed without a call, Valine said he was working late. When holidays came and went, she said he'd promised to visit once things stabilized. She always had an answer ready, always calm, always reasonable. And I wanted to be reasonable too. So I believed her. I boxed up my questions. I folded my worry into smaller and smaller shapes until it fit into the corners of my days. I told myself that if something were truly wrong, I would feel it, that a mother would know. Now driving home with the envelope on the seat beside me, that lie cracked open all at once. Kenner Hill. I said it aloud, testing the sound of it. 2 towns over. Close enough to drive past without noticing. Close enough to hide someone who wasn't supposed to exist. I pulled into my driveway and sat there longer than I needed to, staring at the steering wheel, replaying every conversation, every excuse I had accepted, because it was easier than pushing back. Inside, I set the envelope on the table and didn't open it again. I didn't need to. The words were already burned into me. I grabbed a pen, wrote 1 sentence on a scrap of paper, and folded it carefully before picking up my keys and heading toward Kenner Hill. The road turned to gravel sooner than I expected. My tires crunched the stones as I climbed the slow hill, passing rows of dry corn and a rusted mailbox that leaned like it had given up long ago. Kenner Hill wasn't marked, just a break in the trees where the wind felt different. I followed the sound of nothing. No birds, no engines. Just the hush of pines swaying above me like they were holding secrets. Then I saw it. The red barn stood behind the last line of trees, sagging slightly to one side. Weathered, forgotten. A place meant to be overlooked. I parked a distance away, heart thudding like it didn't trust my hands. "Luan," I called out, just loud enough to reach the wood. Nothing. I stepped closer. Boots brushing broken twigs, mud soft beneath me. I didn't touch the door. I didn't shake the lock. I didn't want to scare him. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the folded note I had written that morning. "It's Mom. I'll return at dusk tomorrow. You're not alone." I slid it under the door and waited for a sound. A movement. Anything. But the barn stayed still. I turned and walked back to the car, forcing myself not to look over my shoulder. If he was inside, he needed to feel safe. If he wasn't, then I'd try again. Back home, the quiet pressed in too thick. I made tea and didn't drink it. I sat on the couch but couldn't remember how long. Around midnight, I found myself in the hallway, standing in front of the old safe I hadn't touched since before Luan left. The key was still where I kept it, taped under the last drawer in the kitchen. My fingers shook as I slid it into the lock. I didn't open it. Not yet. I just rested my hand on the cold metal door and whispered into the silence, "I'm still here. Tomorrow, I would go back." The light was thinning when I returned. The pines cast long shadows that stretched toward the barn like fingers. I stopped the car farther down the road this time and walked the rest of the way, keeping my steps slow, my breathing quiet. He was standing just inside the open door. For a second, neither of us moved. He looked smaller than the boy I remembered. His shoulders sloped forward, his face sharp where it used to be soft. His eyes kept flicking to the trees, the road, the sky, as if the world might rush him at any moment. "Mom," he said, barely louder than the wind. I crossed the space between us and wrapped my arms around him. He stiffened, then sagged, pressing his forehead against my shoulder, like he was afraid I might vanish if he let go. I didn't say his name again. I didn't ask questions. I just held him until his breathing slowed. We sat on overturned crates inside the barn, the smell of dust and old hay thick around us. He talked without looking at me, his words coming out in pieces. Valine told doctors he was hearing things, that he was paranoid. She signed emergency papers while he was still dizzy from a medication he didn't recognize. After that, the story wrote itself. He was unfit. He was unstable. He needed supervision. They kept him in her cousin's basement. Nearly 2 years. Windows covered. Phone taken. Mail opened before it reached him, if it reached him at all. When he resisted, they adjusted the dose. When he begged to call me, they told him I already knew. That, I agreed. "I stopped believing my own memory," he said quietly. "That's how she won." 6 weeks ago, he slipped out while the house slept. No wallet, no ID, no access to his accounts, just the clothes he was wearing and the certainty that if he stayed, he would disappear completely. She took everything he said. My name, my accounts, my voice. I felt the heat rise behind my eyes and forced it down. Crying wouldn't help him. Promises wouldn't either. I listened. I memorized every detail, every pause. When he finally looked at me, there was a question in his eyes he didn't ask, and I knew my answer would have to be more than comfort, because tomorrow we would need proof. I waited until Luan was asleep before I opened the safe. The hallway was still. His door was cracked slightly, just enough for me to hear the soft rhythm of his breath. He'd curled up with a blanket I hadn't seen in years, the same one his grandmother made when he was 6. Some things he still trusted. The key turned stiffly. The hinges let out a low groan when I opened the door. Inside, neat folders, envelopes sealed with string, and a stack of contracts wrapped in a rubber band that had nearly disintegrated with time. I pulled everything out and sat on the floor, my back against the wall. There it was. the deed to the cafe. Luan's name at the top, signed in ink that hadn't faded. Business registration forms, tax documents, even the equipment lease. All of it dated before Valine ever came into the picture. I opened the folder Valine had handed me 2 years ago when she said Luan was stepping back from the business. I'd kept it even then. Something about it felt off. The signatures didn't match. Hers were too smooth. His looked traced, like someone had practiced it over and over. I lined them up side by side and photographed them all. Then I packed the originals carefully into a new folder, locked them in my bag, and drove to the only person I still trusted in town with something this big. Linda was waiting in her office across from the old hospital. We hadn't worked a shift together in years, but when she opened the door, her face didn't change. Just one long look, then a nod. She flipped through the documents in silence. When she looked up, her voice was firm. If your son was declared mentally unfit, without court-ordered psychiatric review, and these transfers happened after that, then not only is the guardianship invalid, the business seizure is potentially criminal. I didn't flinch. I just reached into my coat pocket and handed her the note from the barn. She read it slowly, then set it down. Let's begin with a protective injunction, she said, and get your son's name back on record. I didn't say thank you. I just looked her in the eye and said, he's ready. Linda didn't waste time. By noon the next day, she had filed an emergency injunction requesting access to Luan's sealed medical and legal records. I sat beside her as she typed, listening to the steady rhythm of the keyboard. She spoke in legal terms I didn't always follow, but I understood the tone. Precise, cold, deliberate. The opposite of what Valine had always used. Soft lies wrapped in warmth. That afternoon, my phone buzzed nonstop. Valine Luan's gone for good. I told you that. Why are you digging things up, Valine? You're not helping him. You're hurting him. Let it go, Valine. You don't know the full story. I didn't reply. Linda drafted a response on official letterhead attaching notice of our request and outlining the violations we were prepared to present. The words she chose left no room for doubt. Late in the evening, the court clerk called. The judge had reviewed our request. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for Thursday. Closed session. Private location. No press. But Luan would have to appear. Linda looked at me as she hung up. He'll need to speak. Even just a few words. Are you sure he's ready? No, I said. But I know he won't run. That night I sat at the edge of Luan's bed and told him what was coming. His hands curled into fists under the blanket, his jaw tight. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he nodded. I'll go, he said, but I want to be the one to say it this time. The next morning, I drove him to Linda's office for prep. He wore one of his old jacket's faded sleeves too short, but he held his head higher than I'd seen in years. As we walked up the courthouse steps, 2 days later, I stayed one step behind, not to guide him, but to remind him he wasn't alone. The courtroom was small, quiet, a space built for secrets. But when they called his name, Luan stood and stepped forward. Luan stood when his name was called, shoulders, stiff hands, shaking just enough that I noticed even before he did. I placed my palm flat on the table, close enough for him to feel without holding on. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the judge, breathing the way Linda had taught him, slow in, slower out. He spoke quietly but clearly. He told them about the appointments he didn't understand. The forms he was told were routine. He explained how medication appeared without explanation, how his access to his own email and bank accounts vanished within weeks. He described the basement room, the locked door, the way his name was slowly replaced by diagnoses he never received from an independent evaluation. No drama, no pleading, just facts. Linda followed with documents, medical records signed under emergency provisions that didn't meet state requirements. Financial transfers authorized while Luan was declared unfit conveniently after the transfers were complete. Statements filed under Valine's name claiming Luan had voluntarily left the country. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Valine arrived, late heels clicking sharply against the floor, hair perfect expression, mildly annoyed, as if she'd been delayed by traffic instead of summoned by a judge. She didn't look at Luan. She smiled once, briefly at the bench. That smile didn't last. As the judge read through the violations line by line, something shifted in her face. Her posture stiffened, her mouth pressed thin. When the words temporary guardianship revoked were spoken, she leaned forward as if she'd misheard. When the judge continued business ownership restored to Luan Mera, effective immediately, her hand gripped the back of the chair in front of her. The final words landed quietly but firmly. This matter is referred for fraud investigation. Valine stood abruptly. No apology. No explanation. She turned and walked out, her heels louder on the way out than they had been coming in. No one followed. Luan sat back down slowly, as if his legs weren't sure the floor would still hold him. I didn't speak. I just stayed there steady, as Linda gathered the papers that now belonged to us again. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, and for the first time, Luan asked me where we should go next. Luan moved into the guest room without a word. I didn't ask how long he'd stay. I just changed the sheets, left clean towels folded by the door, and stocked the fridge with the kind of milk he always used to like. He still startled when someone knocked once, even when it was just me tapping lightly to let him know dinner was ready. He never closed the door completely at night. I didn't ask why. Some mornings, I found him sitting on the back steps wrapped in his jacket, staring into the trees like he was still waiting for someone to come pull him away. Other mornings, he slept through until nearly noon, as if catching up on years of rest he'd been denied. I made soup. Different kinds. Broths I didn't bother naming. Just warm bowls left on the table beside him, no pressure to finish. He fixed the garden gate, then the creaky hinge on the screen door. He changed the bulbs I couldn't reach. I left tools out like I had back when he was a teenager, when fixing things was his quiet way of saying he was okay. It was slow, but it was real. One afternoon I came home from the grocery store to find him standing in the hallway holding a stack of old folders. The safe behind him was open. I was looking for stamps, he said, voice a little unsteady. Didn't expect this. Inside were the originals, his name in his own handwriting. Contracts he signed the year he opened the cafe. Tax forms. Lease agreements. All untouched. All exactly as they were meant to be. I kept them, I said. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He set the folders down gently, then stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. He didn't squeeze, didn't cry, just held me there, still and steady. I let my chin rest against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was bracing for something to break. That night, he stayed at the table after dinner and asked what I knew about restitution. Luan asked me to drive him into town the following Monday. He didn't say where he wanted to go, and I didn't ask. I recognized the street before the car slowed. The cafe sat exactly where it always had, the windows freshly cleaned, the sign replaced with a name that meant nothing to either of us. Valine's cousin stood behind the counter. I could see him through the glass, laughing with a customer, moving like he owned the place. Luan didn't go inside. He stood across the street and watched. Not with anger, with focus. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket and began writing hours posted on the door. The names of staff, he recognized the ones he didn't. He noted the supplier truck that arrived late in the afternoon and the menu board taped crookedly inside. We stayed long enough for him to understand the rhythm. Then we left. Every Friday after that, we met Linda in her office. Luan laid out his notes on the table with careful precision. Dates, payroll discrepancies, inventory orders that didn't match reported revenue. Each detail added weight. Each fact built a shape that couldn't be dismissed as emotion or misunderstanding. Linda listened more than she spoke. When she did, it was to ask questions that sharpened what we already had. There was no shouting, no calls made to former friends, no posts online demanding apologies. Luan didn't want witnesses. He wanted records. At home, he began drafting timelines at the kitchen table. I brewed coffee and stayed out of his way, only stepping in when he asked me to check a date or confirm a detail I remembered. It felt less like planning a case and more like restoring something that had been dismantled piece by piece. One evening, he looked up from his notes and said almost to himself, "I don't want it back the way it was." I understood what he meant. This wasn't about reclaiming a place. It was about reclaiming accuracy. The next Friday, Linda called to say the preliminary restitution filing was ready and that we should come in together to review the final draft. Rain tapped steadily on the windshield as I pulled into the lot behind the market. The stalls looked quieter than usual, canopies slick and sagging from the weight of the weather. I pulled my coat tighter and made my way past the empty bakery stand and toward booth 19. He was there, the same boy. Still wearing that gray vest, still holding a clipboard that seemed too big for him. He saw me and smiled, eyes bright, under the rim of his soaked baseball cap. "I remember you," he said. "He told me you'd come back eventually." I nodded, heart heavier than I expected. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small, folded note, but stopped short. "He didn't leave anything this time," he said. "Just said to tell you, thanks for not giving up." I stood still for a moment, letting the rain soak the cuffs of my sleeves. Then I picked up a small bag of onions and added 2 pairs because Luan liked them soft, not overripe. When I got home, the door was already unlocked. I could smell rosemary and garlic, but not the wild kind Valine used to scatter in everything like perfume. This was gentler, real. Luan stood at the stove slicing carrots into even rounds, the broth simmering beside him. He'd found the old soup pot, the one his grandmother used to use. He glanced over his shoulder and grinned. "You went to the market," I held up the bag. "For these. And for the memory." He nodded and dropped the carrots into the pot. "We're not done yet," he said quietly, but without hesitation. "No," I answered, hanging up my coat, the water dripping to the floor. "But we're no longer alone." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. He stirred the pot once, adjusted the flame, and reached up to pull down 2 bowls. Not 1, 2. Then he set the table. One place across from the other. No extra spaces, no gaps. He looked up once just briefly, and I could see it in his face, the part of him that had returned, and the part that never left.